Please.
Good afternoon. Before I start, my name is Grace Hamilton, and I teach creative writing, English, and a world cultures class at Polytechnic School. Thank you. I'm delighted to be moderating this panel. I do want to say I've been bringing students to Archer for many years, and I just want to thank Brian and the school, and especially the young women who organized this. This is such a phenomenal experience for our kids and for faculty. So thank you all very much. This panel is entitled Work Exploring Varied Approaches to Literary Analysis, and it looks to be extremely creative and exciting. And we will start with Lucy Davis from Crossroads, Rumination on Fulfillment.
Thank you. I'm Lucy. I'm going to be reading an academic essay. I shortened the title when I submitted it, but the original title was Wealth Doesn't Lead to Happiness, Conspicuous Consumption in the Great Gatsby. And for the prompt, we were given a painting, which projected behind me, and the Great Gatsby character, Tom Buchanan, and we then had to correlate them through the lens of conspicuous consumption. The moon has risen. Crowds of well-dressed neighbors with dark skin and white teeth mingle on doorsteps. Children and dogs play in the street. Palmer Hayden depicts ordinary festivity in his painting, Midsummer Night in Harlem, 1938. The people dominate the frame, stealing the show from soft, rust-red buildings in a faraway church. They entertain one another and are entertained by each other. It seems the entire block has come out to celebrate a moonlit summer night as neighbors. Certain residents of a fictional part of Long Island also enjoy partying through the warm and bright summer evenings, though quite unlike this Harlem neighborhood otherwise. Part of F. Scott Fitzgerald's 1928 book, The Great Gatsby, the title character holds decidedly distinctive parties, lavish spectacles with dozens of servants and hours of amusement from swimming pools to orchestras. Some parties are smaller, yet just as extravagant, like the drinking escapades that Tom Buchanan and his mistress partake in while bored on a weekend night. Tom doesn't just entertain, he conspicuously consumes. Every action, every purchase temporarily occupies him until he moves on to a new way to spend his seemingly never-ending supply of money and time. The people illustrated in Midsummer Night in Harlem have few material possessions. Yet they enjoy themselves in a way Tom never does, though he seems to be chasing contentedness. He excessively collects both tangible and intangible goods, and his hedonistic excess eventually costs him his love and reputation, proving that wealth makes the route to happiness all the more complex. Nick Carraway, humble, quiet, honest to a fault, neighbor to Jay Gatsby, narrates The Great Gatsby. As a narrator, he flirts with an omnipotence, explaining affairs out of chronological order to prove or preface a character or event in an earlier chapter. He is a second cousin to Daisy, Tom's wife and friend of Tom's. Like Nick, they have recently moved east, confusing Nick, who speculates. Quote, "Why they came east, I don't know. They had spent a year in France for no particular reason, and then drifted here and there unrestfully, wherever people played polo and were rich together. This was a permanent move," said Daisy over the telephone, but I didn't believe it. I had no sight into Daisy's heart, but I felt that Tom would drift on, forever seeking, a little wistfully, for the dramatic turbulence of some irrecoverable football game. End quote. Nick hypothesizes what Tom might seek, but can't quite encapsulate the tumult Tom tries to recapture throughout the novel. Nonetheless, his description of Tom is accurate because Tom himself doesn't seem to know what he is seeking. How can the turbulence of a football game place itself in the life of a middle-aged husband? Tom spends his inherited fortune moving from place to place, never staying long enough to form any sort of community. He finds colleagues equal in both wealth and lack of interest in forming interpersonal relationships. Nick understands this conflict right away, and Tom proves it over the course of the book, romping turbulently about New York, leading a dramatic life with his mistress. Tom craves contentedness with love and life, yet his want for turbulence is perhaps the exact opposite of stability. When Tom seems gratified by marrying the desirable Daisy, he continues to lack the turbulence he experienced in college. When he finally exacts domestic chaos between his mistress, her husband, his wife, and her lover, he is anything but appeased. Tom epitomizes a constant internal conflict between peace and turbulence, turning him into a monster who loses with every action. He wildly absorbs giant houses, extravagant liquor, and sex, yet these conspicuous actions and purchases never satisfy him. Over the course of the novel, Tom learns that he cannot buy drama and a happy ending. Tom also craves the community, like in Midsummer Night in Harlem, who appear to experience the pure form of delight eluding him. Light bathes the people in the painting, heads poking out of windows, couples on doorsteps. It's a powerful light, showing off the red-pressed blazers and the gleam of shiny white shoes, not made for walking. That kind of light isn't coming from the moon, a clear yellow against foggy sky, nor a single street light, nor 5 or 6 leaking windows. The light comes from just beyond the painting, where the painter might be standing, and the subjects know just how to find that light, minimal as it is. On a similar midsummer night in The Great Gatsby, Nick attends a fateful dinner party at Tom's house, where, quote, 2 young women preceded us out onto a rosy-colored porch, open towards the sunset, where 4 candles flickered on the table in the diminished wind. End quote. Fitzgerald uses such exquisite detail to illuminate this lovely night, the longest night of the year. Sunlight lingers in the sky. Tom's life is a cake of extravagance topped by candles which are even relit as guests leave the table at the end of dinner. There's more than enough light to go around, but a dark unfulfillment flickers in the character's eyes. The people of A Midsummer Night's in Harlem fill an intimate scene being painted by someone who knows the song the man with the guitar is playing, someone who keeps a treat in his pocket for the white dog in the street, someone who goes to church with the family in the car driving by. Only someone from within this community, Harlem, could so deftly illuminate the connections on this summer night. These friendly connections are not so in The Great Gatsby. The characters are strangers to each other, keeping secrets, holding grudges. They might wear costumes of 1,000 lavender sequins and hold cups with juice from 1,000 citrus trees, yet will never have a real friend by their side. This holds especially true for Tom, who has wealth all his life, but suffers all the more emotionally. He buys so much he never learns the value of anything, and he keeps relationships like other men keep cars. The more there are, the more faded the connection and uniqueness within them. Meanwhile, the people of Harlem worry about none of this chaos on their perfect midsummer night, wanting for nothing. Tom has everything and desires for everything, conspicuously consuming throughout his life to a lonely, miserable death. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. Next, we have Julia Hallen from Archer, Freedom to Roam, a non-essay on Alice's adventures in Wonderland.
Okay. Hi. This is working, I hope so. I'm Julia. As she said, I go to Archer. And before I started, I just wanted to ask you, how many of you, when you were little, when you were growing up, did you watch or read the book Alice in Wonderland? Nice. Well, I, for one, did not. And I never... nice. And I never really wondered why or thought about why. Let's make sure I know how to use this. Yes. And I never really wondered why until I was reminded whilst reading the book in Mr. Wilkinson's fairy tale course first semester. And I
Sorry.
Not good? I fell. Can y'all, oh my God, can you help me? I'm so sorry.
Let's try that.
Good. Hello? Can you still hear me? Yes. Great. Okay, so after reading the book, I think I found out why. it freaks me out. I mean, a 7-year-old girl going to this weird place that she's never really been to before, filled with people and things that say, eat me, drink me. And without question, she eats it. She drinks it. Strange things happen. She grows, she shrinks, she cries, she screams, she laughs. And she does all this without question. If this were to happen in the quote-unquote real world here, wouldn't something bad happen? Wouldn't she be getting drugged or being poisoned? Wouldn't someone, maybe a humanoid version of the Cheshire Cat, be set up some coy plan to drug this said solitary 7-year-old girl and do away with her, kidnap her, harm her? That's probably what would happen, at least in my head. And yes, even I know within the first few chapters, she does say, maybe I should figure out if this is poison. But it doesn't have a label, so it's probably not poison. It smells fine, and it looks fine, so it's probably not poisonous. So she drinks it, or she eats it. But in, again, the real world, if someone wanted to poison you, would they use a poison clearly marked poison? Would you still eat it if it said poison? Probably not. And this very much freaked me out. And this paired with, I know it's only due to the animation of the movie, but in the film, behind or besides the actual movement of the protagonists, there's nothing. No movement, no change in color, no ambient noise, background not music, but background noise, things that signify that there's life, that there's movement. So those things combined, at least in my head, it makes it seem that this whole concept of Wonderland is a coy plan, a little scheme set up by some creep intent on harming this, again, solitary 7-year-old girl. Luckily, I was given the opportunity to express this. So maybe when you were walking in or eating lunch, you saw the piece at the back of the room. So that is a piece that I'm going to be presenting to you about today. A little bit of background information to give you a bit of context. This was for Mr. Wilkinson's Honors Fantasy and Fairy Tale course, and we had to write a non-essay, which consisted of a page and a half of literary analysis on almost any topic of our choice. And then after that page and a half, he gave us free rein. We could paint, we could draw, we could make music, we could make a video, we could finish that essay. But we were allowed to create whatever we wanted in order to best complete this non-essay. Here you'll see some close-ups, just to zoom in. So there's a combination of drawings, some inspired by the work itself, as you see the title page in the top right corner of the left image, pieces of music, different, different little stories or pieces of writing, and more. So initially, I was commenting on my discomfort and my maybe even inability to understand Alice in Wonderland through a weed, to try to censor a few references, trying to, through words on paper, yell at Alice, and of course through the legendary caterpillar. But slowly I realized that things started to change. While, for example, this page is emergency medical aid. These are a few of the top killing drugs, such as methamphetamines, alcohol, cocaine, LSD, and of course mushrooms. Of course, I feel like that's a reference. But slowly noticed things started to change. Things were no longer a direct commentary, but I began to write down the little voice in my head, almost following this stream of consciousness instead of only actively trying to follow my original plan for creating this piece. So as you'll see on the right, over one of the burn holes, there's a few ants, just because that burn hole is where their anthill starts. And cocaine, I learned in Spanish class that it's good to chew. I learned in Spanish class that it's smart to chew, or it's common to chew cocaine leaves while traveling to Machu Picchu to battle altitude sickness. And also, cannabis. I thought a can of beans wasn't harmful. I thought that they were good to have in case there's an earthquake, if you don't have any access to food. Also, we have the legendary rabbit, who we all know. He reminds me of my dad a bit, always stressed. Right. And he's always afraid of being late. He's always rushing. But is he actually afraid of being late, or is he actually afraid of death by beheading of the Queen of Hearts? Because that is a common thread that we see throughout the book and the film and any associated tale. And also here, where am I? I'm here. So this was almost a step further, because this was the most separate from the initial idea that I could get. So the image on the left is actually one of the scores from the film of How to Train Your Dragon. I love that music score very much. And on the right, you'll see a recipe for toad stew. And I think this was at the point where I really surrendered to that stream of consciousness, where I wasn't focused on writing to fit this prompt, to focus on what I thought I was writing about that discomfort, about drugs, about kidnapping, about the animation. And I honestly think it made me happier. Here are a few close-ups of the piece behind you. So when I was doing this, eventually I came to this realization. I was sitting on the floor of my dad's studio. Fire was raging all over Los Angeles. I had a quill in one hand, a well of ink, a pot of coffee, and a glass of water to paint with, because I didn't like paint that day, I think. Celtic music blasting in my ears. And I came to this realization that while I was criticizing the book and criticizing this wonderland, I'd accidentally and unknowingly fallen into a wonderland of my own. I would write whatever came to my mind, whether that be a game of hangman or a story about a squirrel named Kleiny that Archduke Ferdinand ate. May he rest in peace. And beyond that, I realized halfway through the process that there was no such thing as a mistake. Yes, I was trying to make a design on the Queen of Hearts, and the ink completely bled, but it was fine, it made shadows. Yes, I ripped a piece of music almost completely in half, but that was fine because it became something else. And yes, I tipped over an entire pot of coffee, but it was fine because I used the papers to mop it up because I was going to dye them anyway. And there was this sort of freedom in that. I know I deal with these perfectionism, OCD, but because it became so just focused on what my mind wanted, I didn't feel the need that everything had to be this form of perfection, because perfect doesn't exist, and the concept of perfect might come out of small imperfections that open doors to other avenues. So ultimately, the ultimate action or reason behind it wasn't just to create a commentary on my discomfort on drugs, on Alice's idiocy. It became so wild and so free. I felt like I was on a windswept cliff, and yet I was in my dad's studio at home in Los Angeles. It ended up being so much more to me because it helped me with something else, with my anxiety. So sorry, I have a cold. For once, my anxiety was not my dictator. In so many other pieces, I was always confined by my anxiety, if that was not finishing a piece, not starting a piece because I wanted it to be so perfect, or avoiding something or not following what I wanted to do. But for once, I was its sovereign, not the other way around. And I think that was the ultimate success from the piece, was that it helped me, and it was more than just another piece of schoolwork. So eventually, I was able to find my own wonderland through this form of art, and I hope that you can find yours as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Julia. And last, we have Sammy Rocher and Aviva Intveld from Archer, Paper Moons, and Polka Tunes.
Thank you, Julia. That was amazing. So, I'm Aviva Infeld.
Hi, I'm Sammy Rauscher.
And we are both juniors at the Archer School for Girls. Today we're going to talk to you about Paper Moons and Polka Tunes, an analysis of musical tension in A Streetcar Named Desire.
So just to give a little background as to why we decided to pursue this topic, after we finished reading Streetcar in our AP Lang class, we were both fascinated by Williams' use of music to both reflect characters and scenes. And as we both play instruments, we were interested in composing our own music based on the themes of the play.
And for those of you who haven't read the original 1947 play or have seen the movie adaptation, A Streetcar Named Desire follows Blanche Dubois, our protagonist, who moves from Mississippi to New Orleans to live with her sister, Stella, after falling into debt. Unused to a life without luxury, Blanche's encounters with Stanley, Stella's husband, and the various characters of New Orleans creates a tragic musical story.
So, what is music? Ancient Greek philosophers cast music as a paradigm of harmonious order reflecting the cosmos and the human soul. Or, more simply put, in developing a complex system of scales, harmonies, and consonants, ancient philosophers believed in the capacity of music to both express and influence the human spirit. Specifically, throughout Williams's play, music reflects the tension between fantasy and reality through the corresponding characters of Blanche and Stanley, ultimately calling attention to the inevitability of reality.
So first we're going to talk a little bit about fantasy. New to New Orleans, Blanche meets Mitch, a friend of Stanley's, and falls hopelessly in love with the fantasy that the relationship with Mitch offers. Williams then uses music to symbolize that growing reverie as Blanche turns on the radio to a sweeping and uplifting German waltz. Blanche dances with Mitch to the major, cheerful key and the cyclical 3/4 meter. The waltz is in mezzo piano, which is a moderately soft tune that gently adds to the dreamlike quality of the scene. But when Stanley, upset by the noise, tosses the radio out the window, the spell is broken. Like her music, Blanche's fantasy world is literally thrown out the window. Still, the existence of that world, supported by Williams' choice in music, resurfaces later in the play. A key music when that resurfaces in the play is in Scene 7, when much to Stanley's annoyance, Blanche sings Ella Fitzgerald's rendition of the iconic jazz song Paper Moon. Williams himself designates the tone of the song as a saccharine ballad, which he deems contrapuntal to Stanley's speech. The lyrics here are most telling as Blanche sings, "Say it's only a paper moon sailing over a cardboard sea, but it wouldn't be make-believe if you only believed in me." Through music, Blanche admits this make-believe world, fundamental to the way that she copes with her past and interacts with others. The paper moon and the cardboard sea symbolize the artificiality of the stories that Blanche crafts. Yet if only one believed in her, her fantasy wouldn't be make-believe. In essence, for Blanche's fantasies to become reality, she needs the faith of others.
Moving on to our analysis of reality, the first type of music that displays that is the Varsuviana, which haunts Blanche as a symbol of cyclical dependence and inescapable reality. This is specifically evident in its time signature. Polkas are typically written in 2/2 time, but the Varsuviana is in 3/4 time, creating a continuous sound representative of that cycle of Blanche's dependence on both men and fantasy. So we'll play a little 10-second segment so you can hear that. Oh. Okay, so before Blanche's ex-husband Alan commits suicide, Williams notes, polka music sounds in a minor key faint with distance. The minor key connotes the despair of suicide, and with the added faintness of the music, Williams suggests that Blanche's relationship and dependence on Alan are coming to an end or fading away into the distance. However, soon after, Williams describes the music in a major key, demonstrating the start of a new cycle in Blanche's growing infatuation with men, this time specifically with Mitch. Oh. Okay, so as a separate yet vital continuation of music reflecting reality, trumpets and drums work together to represent Stanley in moments of power, crushing Blanche's fantasy. At the end of scene 10, right before Stanley rapes Blanche, Blanche sinks to her knees, Stanley picks her up, and the hot trumpet and drums from the Four Deuces sound loudly. The trumpets and drums call attention to the scene, loudly overpowering any other music. They are the symbols of Stanley's power, exerted in a way that physically overtakes Blanche and symbolically overwhelms her fantasy. Coupled with the image of Blanche dropping in defeat, the trumpets and drums are harbingers of the destruction of fantasy to come, not just in scene 10, but in the rest of Streetcar. Sorry.
Okay. So this key dominance that Sammy was talking about of reality over fantasy is summed up through the ever-present blue piano, which Williams, the author, describes as just around the corner, intimately tender and warm. This personification creates a sense that the piano itself is alive and feeling, somehow mystically sentient. The blue piano's strict downbeats and duple meter combine with jazz's improvisatory nature to establish a dichotomy of spontaneity in the improvisations and consistency in the meter, mirroring that of fantasy and reality. As the novel comes to a close and Stanley commits Blanche to an insane asylum, the blue piano swells to herald the final dominance of reality over fantasy.
Okay, so moving on to our compositions, as I mentioned earlier, we composed pieces of music based on different themes from Streetcar. So specifically, we have a movement depicting fantasy, one depicting reality, and one of the conflicts between reality and fantasy. So I'll play them for you now, and then we'll describe some of our compositional choices.
Thank you. So for the purposes of today's presentation, originally this presentation was about 20 minutes long. Obviously, we had to cut some things down. The first movement that you heard was only a 15-second snippet, but it was the fantasy movement, which was a rendition of Paper Moon that I talked about earlier by Ella Fitzgerald, which is the same song that Blanche sings to reveal her dependence on fantasy. The short grace notes that you heard embellish the stable, reliable 4/4 tempo, which reflects how Blanche uses her fantasy for her own stability.
And then for the reality movement, it started with a minor chord which symbolized the melancholic nature of Blanche's reality, and then that was interrupted by harsher syncopated violin and also ominous lower range chords that were the harbingers of destruction. And then it cycled through major and minor seventh chords that were syncopated, which depicted the inevitability of reality. And then it ended with chromatic and minor intervals, which are full of tension and mirrored the tension-filled nature of the play itself. And then for the conflict movement, It was based on Chopin's Nocturne No. 20 in C-sharp minor, which I think beautifully captures the wistfulness of Blanche's fantasy. So the flute melody was that wistful and light fantasy. And then the piano accompaniment was in C-sharp minor, which has an undercurrent of sadness, and it was also full of tension. And then the scale passages switched between major and minor keys to symbolize Blanche's fantasy as it spirals downwards. And then at the end, chords overpowered the serenity of the scale passage, which symbolized the inevitable return to a melancholic reality. And now, can you pause that? Sorry. Yes, please.
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, so just to sum everything we said up, Williams portrays the tension and inevitable dominance of reality, Stanley, over fantasy, Blanche, through differences in melody, tone, and meter. Williams often highlights these connections to encourage the reader to take note of music, both in its power to influence and its power to reveal the spirit of life.
And while our society may not have an explicit soundtrack to comment on reality, the musical symbolism of Tennessee Williams' A Streetcar Named Desire reminds us to take notice of the powerful truths in today's music.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow, what a wonderfully creative panel. Thanks to all of you. We have time for a short Q&A, so rather than start with a question from me, I will take questions from the audience.
Okay, this one is for Aviva and Sammy. As far as like the book goes, how do you think that the role of fantasy and reality shaped it within the book, not so much as within the movie? Because I know you guys talked about the movie and like how the soundtrack worked, and it's easier to do it with the movie, but like in which cases would you find that in the book?
So I think that Williams did something very, very interesting. Is this on? Yeah? I don't know, sorry. I think that Williams did something very interesting in his play, which is that you wouldn't normally expect a play to have lots of musical direction. Normally a play is, for the most part, a lot of speech, a lot of dialogue, but Williams includes in almost every scene sound, music, noise. It's very much a part of the experience of reading the play itself. So even though we showed you some clips of, or we had you listen to some clips of music that you might have heard in the movie, they were actually music clips that were directly from the play itself. So we did very much more of a literary analysis, and we didn't actually talk that much about the film. I don't know if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, we cut this out because of time, but also the Varsuviana, which I was talking about, that represents Blanche's reality, is diegetic as well. So it's in the actual play, it's in her head, and she ends up being described that she drinks alcohol to escape that sound that's in her head, which further kind of symbolizes the idea of her reality overpowering her and her wanting to escape that. If that answers your question.
Hi, this is for Lucy. So I read Great Gatsby too. We read it in our English class. We really liked it. And I was wondering, it seems like you depicted the people in the midnight painting as being very fulfilled and kind of not seeking a lot of like material goods. And then on the other hand, you saw Tom Buchanan, who seems to have this kind of tumultuous like soul, and he couldn't figure out what he wanted. Where do you think Gatsby, who kind of seeks material goods, through this sort of irrational dream of seeking fulfillment, like how do you think he fits into that equation?
That's an interesting question. I'm glad you had such a good understanding of my essay. So I think Gatsby is much more humble about his wealth. Not that he doesn't have a lot of it, and he definitely flaunts it, but he's very mysterious, and he doesn't necessarily attach himself to it as much. So if your question is how does Gatsby fall into conspicuous consumption, he certainly participates in conspicuous consumption, and as I'm sure you also talked about in your English class, he's about like new money versus old money, and he's very much new money, and he has very, very visible wealth. But I don't think, to put it bluntly, he's not as terrible of a person as Tom is. So, yeah, well, Tom goes beyond just money and possessions to really hurting other people emotionally. Gatsby is more of a behind-the-scenes character for in terms of his wealth. At his parties, he doesn't come out. No one really knows who he is. So, I'm sorry, I've lost track a little bit of your question in my head, but.
I was just kind of asking because Gatsby has this irrational dream that if he accumulates enough wealth, that's going to then bring him emotions and like the spiritual satisfaction through Daisy, which seems to be like kind of what the people in Midnight Harlem have achieved. I was wondering like how you think maybe Gatsby kind of bridges the sort of distance between.
I think for a brief shining period in the book, Gatsby is fulfilled with Daisy, and then that all goes away. And I think the point of looking at the painting, The Midsummer Night in Harlem, is that it's just one moment, but they seem to have, like, it's just a fragment of a moment that you see them in the middle of the night, in the middle of the summer, in the middle of a year, and they seem to have everything. There's no frowns in the picture. Everyone seems really happy. And Gatsby also has that kind of fleeting moment. So I think, yeah, he definitely does fit in as well to that image. And one could go on to write probably an entire other essay on that.
So all of you in some way or other have incorporated art into your analyses and thus appealed to our creativity and imaginations as your audience members. And I'm just kind of wondering, why did you make that decision, and like why do you think it's important to appeal to imagination in an analysis that's so usually presented as like introduction, 3 paragraphs, then conclusion?
Well, in terms of music, I think music and a lot of different art, and also connecting to what Julia was saying, has the power to heal and to go across boundaries of anything from language to race to country. And so I think we were able to take the ideas of fantasy and reality and make them so much more relatable, not only to us when we compose the music, but to anyone else who is listening to music. And I think that's something really special about the power of music and art in general.
Also, to add on to that, I think I really agree with what Sammy was saying. I think also art can connect with people of all ages, of all languages, whether that be through music or visual arts or anything within that field. And I think that it can, beyond just opening up a portal for imagination, it can guide viewers to not only see or to not only think what they want to think or come up with their own thoughts and opinions and analysis, but also give a piece of insight into what the creator thinks as well, and that can even spark some sort many different discussions or maybe a change in opinion.
Just to add really quickly, as the person on this panel who wrote a conventional essay, it's true, and it did involve art, but that was part of the prompt. It wasn't something that I created. It is definitely a form that could be a little bit limiting, and I thought it was really amazing to see how you all used art to kind of transcend those limitations.
I was going to comment on that as well, since Sammy and I had the experience of both writing a full paper and then also composing the music. And I found that the process of composing music was different in the sense that when you're writing a more traditional analysis, you're trying to find the meaning that the author has left somewhere hidden in the novel, or in our case in the play. Whereas when we were composing music, we were making our own meaning. So there was it's a subtle difference, but to me it meant a lot, because it's the difference between trying to envision what another person was thinking versus building something entirely new.
And one last question.
This is a more general idea. Do you think you could have done what you did with the format that you did with any work? Or is there something specific about the pieces that you're discussing that lent themselves more? And if so, do you think that there's something inherently creative or not in literature?
I can start. So the interesting thing about this, I'm looking right at my English teacher as I say that, is that this essay, we were told we would get a character from the Great Gatsby, and we were told we would get painting to look at, and we were told we were going to be talking about conspicuous consumption, but we didn't get anything else, and we came in to write it in class. So I didn't necessarily choose what I wrote about, but I was prepared to talk about any painting under the sun that we could have been given. So yes, I do think, I mean, I'm not prepared, obviously, but mentally ready to. And so I do think that you can do this with anything, given enough time and with the right thought process. I think any piece of literature and any piece of art can really be combined and correlated into something.
I think one thing that makes a piece really successful is that inspiration and that fire that fuels its creation. I do think that you can adapt any piece of literature into a format, but I do think the piece, regardless if that's music or visual arts or an essay, I think that if you have that inspiration, that fire within you to create something, because you just have to share to the world how you feel or what you think or what you want to convey, I think that's one thing that really makes that piece stand out and gives that piece individuality and personality.
I mean, I have done like compositions of music based on literature in the past, but kind of touching on what Julia was just saying, the connection was a lot different in this versus the other assignment I did last year, and I think, as she was saying, I think the fire and the passion and just something about this play in particular was what really inspired me to do the music for this.
Okay, well, let's give another round of applause for this wonderful panel.
So we're going to take a quick break, just a couple minutes, really just a big stretch, and then we'll get the next panel going.